I wanted to talk about was this whole idea about curiosity. And I was a ridiculously curious child. So badly curious that my dad accused me of having how-come-itis. So I was about 4 years old, and every time something happened, I would say, but how come? How come? How come? How come? How come? I never said why. I don't know. That one wasn't in my vocabulary, I guess. But I consistently said, how come? And he was a lawyer. And so it was interesting because, of course, a lawyer's job is also to ask questions. So here he had this daughter who continually was questioning whatever it was. And it happened to be at a time when there was still a lot of, let's just say, authoritarianism around how parents dealt with their kids. So how come wasn't always something that was appreciated. How come sometimes led to just because that's the way it is, end of conversation. But I was a bit relentless. And so my experience is that as I got older, I continued to ask questions. And my observation of people who tend to come into this community and tend to be part of this teaching or just spiritually curious tend to be people who are really, really good at asking, how come? So where I ended up asking those questions was really when I was about 13 years old. And I started asking, how come life works the way it does? And the only way at that time to sort of get that entry point was really through different faith traditions. So just because I'm got to start with what I know, I went to one particular faith and I started asking the big question that was on my mind at that time, which was, how come my mother has breast cancer? I was 13 years old and she had been diagnosed with breast cancer. It wasn't a minor diagnosis. She was only 37 years old, and it was a major diagnosis. It was a life-changing diagnosis that she had. She's still here today. That's the happy news. The sad news is that the person that spoke with me at the time said, because your mother is a sinner. I was 13 years old. I did not go back to that faith practice. So this thing about asking questions specifically when we're asking them around a faith tradition is very interesting. And there's a history around asking questions within a faith tradition that often says you're not allowed to ask that question. And that was sort of the answer that I received. You can't be curious. Curiosity killed the cat, right? Curiosity killed the cat. What the heck are you doing questioning what is so? The moment you start to question what is so, you bring yourself down a path that could lead into darkness. Now, that's not necessarily spelled out, but there's lots of ancient ways of looking at it that sort of make us think and have tended to make us think that that is what's going on. So a classic example is Adam and Eve. They asked that question, should I pick the apple? What the heck is that tree of knowledge? And before you knew it, right? Everything fell apart after that. Pandora's box is another good myth that we have. You don't open Pandora's box, because if you open the box, all kinds of stuff is going to come out of that. So it's really rooted in a lot of almost cultural tradition to sort of go against the idea of asking any question, unless you are of a certain type, which is probably who we have here. Certain types of people like to do that. But I just want to focus a little bit on that ancient idea, because the ancient idea continues to be alive today. So, and I'm not pointing fingers, I'm just giving examples, okay? So Pope Francis recently, within the last 2 years, and he's very, very open very open pope, very wide open to a lot of different ideas, and really pushing the Catholic Church in many, many ways. He said, "The kingdom of God is among us. Do not seek strange things. Do not seek novelties with this worldly curiosity. Let us allow the Spirit to lead us forward in that wisdom, which is like a soft breeze." So there's the questions that we can ask, and then there's the questions that are a little bit, like I say, more challenging. And I think they fall under two very different streams. So what happened to me as being the one that was the how come itis kid is that eventually I took that whole how come thing on as a career choice. So I became a journalist. And my entire job was to ask people questions. And it was to ask people questions at a time often when they were in a place of turmoil, when they were in a place of tragedy, and sometimes also to sort of figure out what were they really trying to say. So there was a little bit of a, there's this that's happening, and then I want to get underneath it and try and figure out what you're really trying to communicate. So there was an active listening element to it, but it was still me trying to ask the question. What I wasn't doing as a practicing journalist was asking the spiritual question. And that's really what we're here for. So the so-called, I'm just going to use terms that I wouldn't normally use, the so-called evil way of looking at questions, you can see how they can end up in an interesting sphere where you follow a line of questioning in your own mind, and you continue to follow that line of questioning because you're curious and you want to know, and before you know it, you end up somewhere that you never expected. So marketers are really, really good at this. I can give you two examples from a professor of marketing who did a field study. So in the first case, dealing with this whole psychological area of curiosity, what they did was they posted a series of trivia questions near the elevators. And then they posted the answers to these trivia questions near the stairwell. So you got the questions at the elevators, but the answers are at the stairwell. And just by doing that, they increased the number of people that used the stairwell by 10%. Just because they got drawn in to wanting and responding to their own curiosity. It was a trivia question. It wasn't really significant, and yet they got drawn in over here to do something completely different. Another one that marketers have used apparently is they put jokes on placards that are selling fruit and vegetables. And then they put the punchline inside the bags. So you don't actually get the punchline unless you buy the bag of fruit and vegetables. And so curiosity, again, is increasing the sales of the fruit and vegetables. So we have to be careful about when we're using our curious mind and being conscious about where it's taking us. Because maybe that isn't a choice that we necessarily want to make. Maybe we want to make a completely different choice. Maybe we want our curiosity, which is our natural being and a God-created, spirit-created part of who we are, is something that we want to be able to nourish and encourage, but keep it on a certain level so that it has some value to us, instead of necessarily perhaps value to somebody else, like a marketer, for instance. And I do marketing too, so it's not an anti-marketing thing, it's just about how it works. So the thing is that as we're kids, we're naturally curious. And the questions that we ask when we're children about how do things work, and as we get older, who am I? Those questions are completely different kinds of questions than the other questions that we may be asking. Questions that are rigorous, if we think about somebody like Christopher Columbus, for example. He was somebody who obviously had an adventurous mind and an adventurous spirit, and was questioning, open to questioning, and truly proving that whole question about, is the world really flat? I don't think it is. I'm willing to go out and explore and prove that otherwise. And so we're grateful for the intellectual questioning mind because it expands us and allows us to have a greater experience of who we naturally are. So that scientific questioning mind is of great value. And the psychological questioning mind that comes deep within us is also of great value. One of the things that we do here is we work on the power of asking the question, the power of asking the question of ourselves. So, what do we really want is often a question that we can ask. So if we're working with somebody and something isn't going well in our lives at any given moment, the question that's really wonderful to ask is, okay, there's this, and I don't necessarily want to know all the why, because sometimes why just takes you further down into a deeper story of whatever that is. I want to know, what do you want instead? What would you like to have if you're experiencing one thing? What would you like to have instead? And then we start to get curious about what that want may be. What is that want? What are we really seeking? What are we really looking for? And how can that inform the kinds of conversations and the kinds of experience that we have of ourselves? So one of the things that happened to me when I first came to a Center for Spiritual Living was that I was in a really, really dark place. I was a new mom. I was overwhelmed. I was in a job that I was struggling with, and I really had lost my way in terms of where my spiritual practice was. If I had one, I didn't know what it should be. And so I thought, well, I might as well just show up somewhere and see what happens. And so I chose Centers for Spiritual Living in Kelowna and ended up there. And on the third day that I was there, a woman came to me because I just basically went to the services and I just cried. And then I go to the next one and I just cry again. And so on the third time, as I was sitting there crying and I couldn't get out of my chair, she came up to me and she just sort of asked me, what do you want? And I said, I just want to be able to find some peace. I just want to be able to find some peace within myself. And so the fact that she was able to ask me the question meant so much to me, because I was able to look at her eye to eye and hear somebody that was curious about who I really was, as opposed to who I was externally presenting myself to be. And she was willing and capable of being able to shift me slowly from state A to state B and on from there. My experience is that the question is never ending. Emerson says that we have responsibility, personal responsibility, to be mindful of every thought that we have, and that every thought continues to be some form of a prayer. That's Meister Eckhart as well. He also said that. So we're personally responsible for the thoughts that we have, and we get to make a choice about what thoughts we want to have and put those things into action. So being curious is a way of trying to discern for ourselves exactly what it is that we want. Being curious also enables us to create bridges with people that we otherwise might not be able to create those bridges with. So if I sit down with somebody and I say, like, even as a journalist, I can tell you I would treat a politician very differently, right, than I would treat somebody who just gone through some kind of a tragedy. You know, the politician, I've got to be the public and ask some pretty hard-pointed questions to make sure that they're on track. But the person that's just been through a tragedy is going to be a completely different experience. So asking the question in such a way that there's a compassion and an openness allows for a greater connection to be formed. And that connection is actually spirit showing up right in the midst of that conversation. Do you understand how that works? Does that make sense? I used to think about husband-wife relationships or partner relationships of whatever nature they happen to be, those close, intimate relationships. And so you've got person A, and then you've got person B. I'm just person A, person B, there's no fists. And they each have their own identity, right? But then what happens is between those two, as they continue to spend more time together, they create almost like a third entity that exists in between the two of them. That is what happens as we entwine and become combined if we're in that place of openness. And you can't have an intimate relationship without being in a place of openness. So you've allowed that third entity built on a loving structure to be able to flourish. Even when we're sitting here in this room, these entities, and I don't mean them like an entity, like a alien thing, I'm not talking about that, but that energy, right? That energy field is existing in and between each and every one of us here right now. And so when we get curious in a loving and compassionate way about what's happening for the other person, what their experience is like, how was your Canada Day? Did it make you happy? Those people that were stuck in Ottawa for a long time, they might not have been so happy on Parliament Hill. What was your experience of Canada Day? How did that make you feel about being in the country? Were you happy about it? Were you not happy about it? What's some of that dialogue that perhaps, people are saying we need to have deeper dialogue right now? Deeper dialogue about important things about who we are as a nation. So if we open up the way for that and we open up our ability to be able to ask those questions and trust that we have the compassionate ability to ask those questions and hear openly, we create a bigger and a better world for ourselves and for those who are with us. So curiosity can be a tricky little creature, right? That little guy who wants, a little guy that was telling me, how come, over and over and over again, that little thing was in a place where I was asking questions about everything. Absolutely everything. No discernment, right? No discernment about what I wanted to ask for, what my purpose was I being respectful, was it really necessary? None of that was happening. Instead, I was just blah, 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 asking the question. So as we get older and we start to think more about what it is that we want to ask, then we start asking more pointed questions, either about the other or about ourselves. So I just wanted to give you another example, which I thought was really great. So I mentioned to some of you that we take all kinds of ideas from different faith traditions, and I came across a faith tradition that I don't know a whole lot about, but their critical piece of their tradition actually is all around questions, and they call them queries. And this is the Quaker faith. How many of you are familiar with the Quaker faith? No. Yes, a little bit. A little bit. Yeah, I was kind of like, I know it, but just a little bit. So the one thing that I thought was kind of interesting is that the Quaker faith goes back to 1656. So it's been around for a very long time. And what they do is they ask questions, they call them queries. And it's questions around all different kinds of things. So here's some queries that they ask themselves. Are you open to the healing power of love? It's a good question to ask ourselves. Are we open to that? If we're not open to receiving that healing power, how do we think we're going to experience it? And if we think we're only open a little bit, by asking the question, we get to maybe ask ourselves if we want to be open just a little bit more, right? What would that look like if I opened myself up just a little bit more to that expression and that experience? Here's another question that they suggest. Do you try to set aside times of quiet for openness to spirit? Do you set time aside for it? So these are contemplative questions to ask ourselves about where we are in our spiritual practice and how we can choose to expand that. And they may not apply to any of you, but these are traditional Quaker ones. And here's another one. Do you work gladly with other religious groups in the pursuit of common goals? What a great question for a religion to ask that of their members. thought that was interesting. So that's sort of another way of looking at it. Einstein says, I have no special talents. I am only passionately curious. Curiosity is, in great and generous minds, the first passion and the last. It is the thing that we continually ask ourselves over and over again. So the last thing that I want to mention is the fifth agreement, which was, how many of you have read the 4 agreements? A few of you? Yeah. So the 4 agreements, I won't go through all of them, but it's, if I've missed one and you know it, shout it out. So don't make assumptions, don't take anything personally, always do your best. And what's the other one? Be impeccable with your word. Thank you. So the 5th agreement has to do with being skeptical. So being skeptical is a way of us being masterful about asking whether we really are hearing the truth, no matter where it is that we hear it, because truth is truth. And when we're skeptical, we keep our mind open to try and figure out, are we really hearing the truth or are we hearing aversion? Yes.
What's the 4th one?
The 4th one was be impeccable with your word.
Word.
Your word, yeah. So, for example, Christopher Columbus, if he'd only listened to what everybody had said, you know, we probably wouldn't be here, any of us, right? Except for the Aboriginal people would obviously still be here. But there would have been a different experience, right? Because he never would have gone past asking that question. So being skeptical is a very good quality to have because it allows us to still maintain our openness and at the same time continue to expand to a greater idea of who we are. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. Just some thoughts around curiosity and its role for us.